We have a very special face-off lined up for you. Congress MP Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Vice President of the BJP, Mr. Panda, joining us live here on NDTV. Thank you so much for your time. Dr. Tharoor, starting with you, you gave a brief bite and in which you said that you're disappointed with the budget speech. You said that it was short, it lacked substance, and there was a lot of rhetoric. Why do you say that?
Well, the rhetoric was evident in all the generalities the finance minister used. Everything about confidence and hope and pride and so on, but very little about the actual impact of all these measures she was talking about and not talking about on ordinary Indians. The things that I wanted to see addressed that were simply ignored by her, unemployment, for example, which is at a 45-year high, 8.7% according to the CMIE, and shockingly high for youth aged 20 to 24 at 45.4%, which is a record, probably a world record. Now, we can't live in a country where our young people have no hope of work. We're looking at a sort of national new normal unemployment rate of 8 to 9%. How can the finance minister not even touch on this? Then if you look at the way in which agriculture and manufacturing jobs have been falling, the only jobs at all being created in recent years have been in financially precarious sectors like construction work and low-end service, whereas educated unemployment is worsening every year. For graduates, we now have a record unemployment of 35.8%. For postgraduates, 36.2%. So we're looking at a colossally worrying economy when it comes to the unemployment situation. And the government takes refuge in pointing to self-employment figures. But the fact is the number of unpaid workers in the self-employed category has more than doubled to 95 million in the last 5 years. And a high level of self-employment merely means there are no alternatives for paid employment. Okay. The ILO even deemed them to be employed if they're not paid. Now, this is just one issue. One issue is the fact that our employment situation is catastrophic, completely unmentioned. There are many other issues, but I know Jay will need some time as well.
Yeah.
Just want to say that the fundamental other concern I have is about incomes and inequality in our country. People have seen no real growth in their incomes in the rural areas. The annual growth rate of real rural wages has been negative. I'm looking at government figures. And so you're looking at a situation where people are suffering. There was a Reuters survey this month in which 85% of those surveyed said that they'd seen no increase in their incomes or a decrease in their incomes. The poorest 20% of our country has seen their income levels shrink 52% since 2015-16.
Okay.
So it's a terribly difficult situation, and inequality rising. The top 20% have seen a 40% rise in their income growth in the last NDA term. The bottom 60% have seen negative income growth.
Okay.
So all these are the issues that we are worried about: unemployment, inequality, rising poverty. And when the government says they're pulling people out of poverty, they're using very dubious numbers, which are not corroborated by international agencies. Okay. And yet, 80 crores of free food grains to people, which suggests there are an awful lot of people in need of free food. And the World Bank actually said that 80% of those in the world who slipped into poverty in 2020 during the pandemic years, 80% of them were Indians, 230 million
okay.
Indians.
Dr. Tharoor, let me take the opening comments also from Panda. Panda, you have to respond to all that Dr. Tharoor's charge is. But before that, also I want to understand that in 2019, during the vote on account, there were substantial announcements for farmers under Prime Minister Kisan Nidhi. Taxation also saw several fresh announcements. This time around, though, there has been nothing which could be, put in the category of being populist. Do you see this? I mean, should we be seeing this as a sign of a government confident of returning?
Look, first of all, my friend Shashi Tharoor has a very difficult job, which is to rain on a parade which is being celebrated not just by Indians, not just by 1.4 billion Indians, but throughout the world. I mean, the Indian economy is being celebrated all across the globe for being the fastest growing large economy for last several years in a row. Having achieved so many things, the cumulative effect of which we are seeing, which has been noted in today's interim budget. Just think about a few things. Average incomes have increased 50%. This is not something that happens due to conjuring of numbers. The 800 million people that have benefited from the Garib Kalyan, Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana makes up for the fact of all the shortcomings that Shashi is talking about. Now, if you look at rural consumption, it clearly puts a lie to the allegations of the opposition that somehow rural Indians are doing less well. Look at the fact, one of the greatest achievements is the achievement of 10 million women having become Lakhpati Didis because of the outreach program of the Modi government for women. And the target which has been kept for 20 million women is now being changed to 30 million. So you can see how rapidly this is coming up. About 5.5 million youth having got upskilled and trained in the skills development area. 7 IITs, 16 triple ITs, 7 IIMs, 15 AIMS, 390 universities having been set up in the last decade. And if you talk about major announcements, I think the biggest, the two areas that really catch my attention is the double-digit growth for capex at more than 11%, while at the same time managing government borrowings, restraining it so that leaves more credit flow for the private sector and the average Indian citizen. Now, this is quite an amazing achievement. And on top of that, the fiscal deficit, now this is something that many opposition commentators would rather not dwell on, but the fiscal deficit, which had gone up very high because of the pandemic and the effect it had on the economy, having come down to much better than expected, 5.8%, and to go down to 5.1%. The importance of this is that the fiscal deficit is the single biggest factor in controlling inflation and in the country's own sovereign rating, which impacts FDI and many other aspects like that.
Okay.
And FDI itself has doubled compared to the earlier period. Tax revenues have tripled. I've already talked about the rural areas. Now, if you look at farmers, the amount, not just farmers, but everybody else, 34 lakh crores have been spent through DBT, and which has led to 2.7 lakh crore savings. These are unimaginable. These were unimaginable 10 years ago. The reality is that the job of an interim budget is to consolidate. And you're quite right. The government, the Modi government, is extremely confident of the support of the people. You've seen that throughout. And if even a small percentage of what my friend Shashi is saying was acceptable to the people, that wouldn't be the case.
Okay. Dr. Tharoor, will you also not agree that saturation of schemes is in fact secularism in action? And what Finance Minister said on the floor of the House, which was quite unlike a budget speech, that for this government, social justice is not an empty political slogan.
There's a lot to answer on that, but before I do that, I do want to respond on a couple of things. Jay talks about the world celebrating our economic growth. Then he has to explain to me why it is that FDI inflows as a percentage of GDP is the lowest in 16 years, that our share in global GDI inflows has fallen to a record low of just 2.8% of the total FDI inflows in the world in 2023. So money isn't coming here. The government keeps talking about these things. The fact is that the first half of this financial year, April to September, the gross FDI was just 10.1 billion, which is the lowest it's ever been since 2007. So if the world is celebrating our economy, why aren't they investing in it? They've actually come down considerably, and foreign investment as a percentage of GDP, which was at 3.6% of GDP under our government, is down to just about 1% of GDP under NDA. And I might add that in the same period of the last NDA term, the Vietnamese foreign direct investment rose to about 4.5% of their GDP. So while other countries are rising, ours is going down. So I would just want to challenge the proposition that I'm raining on a parade that the rest of the world is celebrating. Then on the question of all these social schemes, look, there are lots of good things to be said and lots of bad things as well. I welcome the Jan Dhan accounts. They gave them a catchier name than our boring direct benefits transfer name. But let's not forget 20% of those accounts are still inoperative as of December, that is last month. And I'm quoting a government response in the Lok Sabha during the winter session. And nearly half of those inoperative accounts belong to women. Jay is asking, as if women are sort of becoming lakpatis overnight, half of their Jan Dhan accounts are actually empty. And on the other schemes, 6 out of 10%, 60% of the 11 crore toilets they're claiming under Swachh Bharat Abhiyan have no water supply. You're looking at total expenditure to the Agriculture Ministry and schemes for farmers' welfare have been declining as a percentage share of the total budget every year since 2019. The number of beneficiaries enrolled against the Kisan Samman Nidhi Yojana has come down from 11.8 crore, a peak in 2019, to just 3.78 crores in 2022, a 67% decline. You've got the Fasal Bima Yojana, where they've got 689 lakh farmers enrolled, but claims have been paid so far only to 7.8 lakh farmers. One can go on. Ujjwala Yojana, they talk about a large percentage, 90 lakh beneficiaries of the scheme cannot refill their cylinders because they can't afford to. Only half or so, no, not even half, I beg your pardon, only about 30% were able to afford more than a couple of refills. 9.6 beneficiaries took none at all. 11.3, only one refill. So we're looking at a situation where you can talk about the schemes and say this is social justice in action. But if you look into the schemes in any detail, you find disappointment after disappointment. Mudra Yojana, you've given 83% of the loans under Mudra Yojana have an average amount of less than 50,000 rupees. How can you expect that to be life transforming? And meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, you've got inflation going up. The aam aadmi or the aam aurat is going to a market and finding that she can't afford what she was able to feed her family this time last year. Now, these are questions that also the government has to be accountable for.
Absolutely. Jai Panda, will you respond? Because there are a lot of statistics that has been thrown at you by Dr. Tharoor. It certainly presents a very, very concerning picture.
Not at all. I think, the elitism that is represented when Shashi says that loans of up to 50,000 rupees don't mean anything means he's out of touch with rural India. A loan of 50,000 rupees can and has transformed the lives of tens of millions of women. If you look at the Mudra loans, out of the 43 crore loans, about 30 crore loans have been given to women. And the huge amounts that have been disbursed are the reason why so many people are becoming self-sufficient. Now, Shashi talked about FDI as a percentage going down. The reality is, nobody can deny that 596 billion in the last decade is double of what was achieved in the decade before that in the UPA government. The reality is that the Indian economy is growing so fast, and also domestic investment has picked up very rapidly. That's why the ratios will show as if there's a decline, but in absolute terms, India is the toast of town in terms of investors from all over the world wanting to come to India. Now, you can go on and on about many other areas where huge improvement has been made. Look at the seafood sector. I come from a coastal state like Odisha. Seafood exports have doubled. Look at the kind of investments that have been made in infrastructure. The average Indian citizen more and more is taking advantage of this infrastructure, whether it is the expressways, the trains. Another 40,000 coaches of the railways are going to be converted to Vande Bharat. Look at the doubling of the airports in the last decade, and it's no longer just a luxury that only the wealthy travel by air. I can go on and on, but the reality is that, earlier Shashi referred to unemployment. Throughout the last year, on any given month, if you scanned the business newspapers, you would see that new employment generation of more than 1 million a month happened repeatedly throughout the year. This has been a holy grail of Indian economic planning for decades. And the fact that private investment is now catching up, is boosting, and the government is making room for that, for more credit flow, while at the same time taking the percentage of capex to 3.4% of GDP as compared to 2.8% when the Modi government took over. This is huge, and this is transforming the lives of people. The reality is, when you see the main budget in July, as Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman pointed out, that is when the main roadmap for Viksit Bharat, for the developed India of 2047 that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been setting the target for, will be fleshed out completely in detail.
Okay.
But certainly the interim budget very strongly consolidates a decade of superb achievements.
Okay. Dr. Tharoor, infra push continues, grip on fiscal spending remains. There is no populist announcement. My question is, how will you really fault this vote on account?
Well, I think I've already given you a number of reasons why I fault it, Maria. I'm not going to rain on the infrastructure parade because that's something which indeed I think all of us acknowledge has made good progress. Highways, ports, airports, fine. Though I would challenge Jay that the sort of Aam Aadmi is not exactly flying all over the place just yet. Jay, until you improve their incomes, they're not going to be able to afford to do that. And real income growth is non-existent. If anything, there's been a decline in incomes for the bottom 60% of our population. You mentioned 1 million jobs a month. I would like to know where you got that number from. I've been looking at CMIE data. I've been looking at every other kind of government data. I've never seen that number before. So I don't think there are that many jobs being created. In fact, even the government takes refuge under notions of self-employment, but this is largely unemployed self-employment. I mean, unpaid self-employment, which the ILO doesn't even consider to be employment. As for the fiscal deficit, Maria, since you mentioned it, yes, it's not too bad, 5.13%, which actually doesn't compare that well to UPA, because between 2004 and 14, our fiscal deficit was averaging 4.63%. So 5.13% is not exactly an improvement. It's worse, but it's not that much worse as it could have been, agreed. Having said that, the fact is that the fiscal deficit at the end of December already touched 55% of the annual budget target, and the gross debt to GDP ratio has crossed the 80% mark, which the IMF has made some comments about, saying they're very concerned about seeing how high the gross debt to GDP ratio is. There's no doubt, and Jay will agree with me on this, that the worst possible scenario for an emerging market, which we still are, is the lethal combination of high debt, low employment, and high food inflation. Now, so far, all of these, I'm afraid, from our point of view, is very much in the danger mark.
Okay, last word to you, Jay Panda. Besides all the allegations that are coming your way, I also want to understand from you, the point of Bhai Bhatijawad, which is again uncharacteristic of a budget document. The budget may not be political, but the speech certainly was.
First of all, only a celebrated wordsmith like my friend Shashi could even attempt to brazen it out on the fiscal deficit, because the UPA did not see a pandemic like COVID, and that is when the fiscal deficit went up to double digits. And it has been brought down to 5.8 and now targeting 5.1, which is being celebrated today by all economic commentators. And without the COVID pandemic, the fiscal deficit and budget management of this government has been superb. I'll conclude by saying one more thing. Not just is it secular to truly practice sabka saath, sabka vikas, because in these massive governmental programs, nobody can point out to discrimination against any section of society. And I think that is a superb example of the last mile coverage, the Antodaya philosophy, which Prime Minister Modi has been championing. Finally, I'd like to say, in the spirit of cooperative federalism, the 75,000 crores that has been set aside for helping states to make the difficult policy changes for economic reform is, I think, phenomenal. This is not getting commented often enough, because it's very difficult for states to get away from populism. And this kind of massive funding, along with similar funding for example, 1 lakh crore at virtually free money of 50 years interest-free for research and development, especially for startups, is phenomenal. So I think you will see in July a much bigger picture with a more detailed roadmap of all of this.
And I'm hoping that in July...
On that, Maria?
Yes, please.
Brief word, because I can't let the federalism claim go unchallenged. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where the state share of tax revenues has actually come down to just 30% in the last budget, a far cry from the 42% that had been promised by the 14th Finance Commission. And the government in the center has been increasing their cesses and surcharges to such a level. Under UPA, it was 8% of gross tax revenue. That number has tripled to 28.08% of gross tax revenue under the NDA. So they're taking money that could be spent by the states who are closer to the problems of the people, and they're spending it as central schemes. I don't think that can particularly be seen as a contribution to cooperative federalism, as my dear friend Jay has it. I want to just a reference to a few indexes that Jay is familiar with. We're 111th out of 125 countries in the Global Hunger Index. We are 132nd in the Human Development Index. We are 131st on the Global Economic Freedom Index, 161st in the World Press Freedom Index, and 126th in the World Happiness Report.
So
I'm glad Jay is happy because clearly most of our
Jay
people...
wants to respond to that as well. So this will continue. But Jay, quickly, 30 seconds, and then I have to wrap up this discussion.
Just 10 seconds.
Yeah.
You know, unfortunately, all these global indices, and you know, Shashi is a great global citizen, but these global indices are very, very discredited because the hunger index ranks India lower than the countries to whom we give food aid.
Okay.
The press freedom index ranks India lower than war-torn countries in the Middle East. They're discredited, and Shashi really should stay away from citing those.
I'm hoping that in the month of July, both of you will be joining me for debating the main budget. Whichever government presents it. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Jai Panda. Pleasure speaking to you on this budget.